Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to the Korg M1 tutorial series. Today we're going to have a look at extending the synthesizer beyond simple programs. We're going to have a look at combis and multis. These are different ways of combining up to 8 programs together simultaneously to produce far more complex sounds. And as you'll see today, combis and multis are very similar, and it really depends on the context to which you're applying them as to which one you'll use. Anyway, hope you enjoy this video today. Please check out the Patreon and channel member links below if you'd like to help support my channel so that I can carry on making these videos. Now, I'm going to spend the vast majority of today talking about combis because this is actually the multi-program use to which I put the M1, and I'll explain the differences between those and multis once we've actually had a look at the concept of combining multiple programs together. So I've pressed the Combi button, and here we have loaded up the film score preset. This is Combi number 1. If you open your browser, you'll see M01. Here it is, film score. Double click that to confirm. We've got the sound straight out of the box. And what you're hearing there is 4 different programs being layered together, and you can see the 4 timbres. Now, I use the word timbre there because that's really the sound. So the program is the collection mechanism via which the sound is contained, and the timbre is the sound, and Korg in their manuals talk about these 8 slots being timbres. So we're looking at timbre number 1 here, and if we solo it, you're just hearing the choir. If I very quickly, there's the tubular bells and strings, pretty obvious what the piano is going to do. When you add all of those 4 sounds together, that composite sound is the total output of the combi. I don't really need to explain what mute does, do I? The next button along, IFX, stands for internal FX, and this is the means by which we can enable or disable the individual insert effect for that program. Remember that every single program has its own pair of insert effects, and these IFX buttons are the means by which we enable or disable those effects. So this isn't a master effect. In fact, at this point, let's just have a quick look at the master effects, because the combi itself, the entire sound, has its own pair of effects, and here they are in the master effects page. Now, we're not really at the stage yet where I want to start talking about I/O, inputs and outputs. We'll get a little bit deeper into the subject of inputs and outputs when we bring multi into the conversation. I just wanted to show you the fact that the entire combi sound has a pair of master effects, and there they are. Having said that, let's jump back to the performance page. This little arrow button is very unassuming but important. This allows us to manipulate programs inside the combi. So let's say I want to add a 5th program into this combi, introduce a new timbre in other words. And now if I click load, so let's say we'll have this distorted guitar. Let's hear that timbre on its own. And then in combination with the others. Let's say I've done some editing on this guitar, it doesn't really matter what, let's just change some of the values. And now I want to duplicate that copy so that I'm going to do something, let's say with the pan settings. Head back into my menu options, I can copy, head down to timbre number 6 and paste. So now this instance in slot number 6 contains exactly the same values as the edited version that's in slot number 5. From that point, they're completely independent programs, and I can edit them to my heart's content. As I toggle back and forwards, you can see those programs have nothing to do with each other. You're not editing the reference to the original program. You've made a genuinely new copy of it. Now I've changed my mind. I don't want timbre number 6 anymore. I can clear it down. The rest of the options in the performance page are fairly self-explanatory. I don't need to describe what level does or pan. And this is our output routing. As we saw in, I think it was episode 1 of this series, I showed you the capacity to generate multiple outputs. Let's just have another quick look at it. As things stand at the moment, we're just dealing with 1 and 2, so we're only outputting to tracks 1 and 2, to outputs 1 and 2 at the moment. But if I head into my routing options in Cubase and activate the second pair of outputs, so you can see that they're labeled outputs 1 to 8, but each one of these outputs is a pair. So now I've just engaged outputs 3 and 4, which we can label independently. If we want to keep everything nice and neat. And now each of these outputs that you can see in the M1 is routing to these different locations. So if I mute my outputs 3 and 4, we're just going to hear quiet strings and distorted guitar on track 1, on output 1. And now the other way around. Now I'm just going to slow down at this point. If I play a note, you'll see that there is signal going to 1 and 2. There we go. That's because of the Master FX routing. So let's jump back over to that Master FX page and have a look at what's going on here. Channels 3 and 4 by default route via this panning matrix into FX2. So it's going through the exciter. We don't particularly care. The important thing is that it's being routed to 1 and 2. If I mute those outputs now, 3 and 4 are completely independent and we only hear this output stream. So now you're just hearing the tubular and the piano 16 on a dedicated, isolated output channel. I've got a feeling I misspoke earlier actually. I was talking about this left-hand panel and I think I might have referred to it as the performance page. In fact, the performance page is the tab on the right-hand side. As I click between these different pages, you can see that when you're in combi mode, you always see the same information on the left-hand side, but really this is the performance page. And this is the primary means by which the M1 interacts with the outside world. I've said previously in this series that the integration with external hardware is pretty minimal on this M1. And the performance page gives you the greatest amount of flexibility that you're going to get. And there's quite a lot to go at in this page. It's deceptively powerful. If we start off at the top left-hand corner, we have this table button. By default, it's going to give you this appearance. And what you're seeing here in the top part of the page is all of the information about the currently selected timbre. So as I change these values, let's make the cutoff different for timbre number 2. And as I toggle between them, you can see that value changing. If I click the table button, now you see all of the values for all of the performance parameters for all 8 timbres. This isn't a particularly attractive page though, so let's jump back to our zoomed in view. So what we're seeing in the top panel now is information just about timbre number 1. Firstly, take a note of the pretty bad dark grey on black interface design we have here. If I draw, I can't actually see this at all because I'm backlit here, but there's kind of an upside down house surrounding the greyed out oscillator. This value on its own is an oscillator value. And then you have a weird, it's something like this. I've had to memorize it before I started the video because I literally can't see these lines at all. This is your VDF performance section. Then we have a combined VDF and VDA section for these 3 controls. And then at the end of the day, that says insert effects. I can just about see that. Let's start off by having a look at the VDF controls. I'm going to adjust the cutoff to -9, that's as good as any. If I jump over to the VDF page for timbre number 1, don't forget all of these pages are always looking at the currently selected timbre. Here's timbre number 1, and when we have a look at the cutoff, it says 81. Let's jump back to the performance page and I'll make a change to this cutoff value. It's now -23. It's had no impact on the primary cutoff value inside the program itself. Now let's concentrate on what we're actually doing. I'm going to solo the choir. Reset this cutoff value to 0. So I press Control on my keyboard, Control click. Okay, there's my choir out of the box. That's the soloed timbre inside this combi. Now I'm going to pull the cutoff value down from the performance page. Let's have a look. Here's the spectrum analyzer. Well, quite clearly throwing away those high frequencies. But none of the changes that I make in this page are visually represented in the filter. In other words, it's a layer mask. I'm applying a second layer of filter modulation, and the cumulative total of those 2 values, my performance cutoff plus my filter cutoff, are going to give me the sound that I actually hear. So what's the point of this page? Why are we duplicating all of these controls? Well, it's all a matter of perspective. What you're seeing in the performance page is an edited highlights of the 8 controls that Korg think you're most likely want to interact with, but more importantly, they can also be made to operate very quickly at the program and or combi level at the click of a button. These link options down the left-hand side enable us to change the nature of what this cutoff control does. At the moment, we're just manipulating timbre number 1. If I activate linking, however, all of these lights light up, and now when I change this value, I'm adjusting every one of those cutoffs simultaneously by the same amount. So when I drag this up, basically all of these values are being changed simultaneously. Let's create some offsets to make it really obvious what's going on. I'm going to head down to timbre number 2 and adjust the cutoff for that individual timbre, then head back into linked mode. And now when I increase, you can see they're all being adjusted simultaneously. So that's something that you can't do from inside the program level. Another thing that you can't do from inside the program level is interact with your hardware. If you right click on this cutoff value and say learn, now if I move any control on my, I've got a Native Instruments keyboard here, I'm just going to move one of the CC knobs, going to output a CC27, this particular knob. So now as I move that knob, you can see I'm physically, you can't see me, but I'm just basically turning the knob on my keyboard. And now I'm directly interacting with the hardware, with the M1 from the outside. That's not something you can do from the individual pages. Now a quick word about this function, and this is something that I strongly dislike. You don't have the ability to unlink. It doesn't matter what options you have set in your linking table, whether or not you're trying to manipulate more than one parameter simultaneously, this knob is always going to operate on all 8 controls. Don't know why, that's just the way it is. It looks like you can individually map single functions. You can click them and alter the adjustments. That's all very well and good. But if I right click and ask it to learn, firstly the control jumps up here for some inexplicable reason. But if I use a different controller, it switches back to using all 8 knobs. So just bear in mind the integration, as I've said previously, the integration between hardware and the M1 is flaky at best, but at least there's a means by which you can do some sort of interaction there. This linking can get as fancy as you want. So if you want to link 3 different timbres together, you can do it manually, or you can click all linking on, and now every one of the parameters will change simultaneously when I adjust the value, or disable them all completely. Now let's say I've made a change to this tubular timbre, so I've adjusted the cutoff of this value down a little bit. You can actually bake this into the VDF setting. So at the moment, my primary VDF on the tubular is set to 20, and in the performance page, I have -8. If I drop this little arrow down and say apply performance, this 8 is going to get converted into genuine internal VDF values, and the cutoff will be reset to 0. So let's do that. I'm going to apply the performance parameters. The cutoff now just got set to 0, and when we have a look at the VDF, 20 minus 8 equals 12. So this is a means by which you can potentially tailor the sound to your liking, to what you want. But then you say, right, I'm happy with the performance levels. I'm now actually going to convert that into the core sound and alter the combi behind the scenes. The only other thing that warrants mention in this page is the curious combination of VDF and VDA. This seems unintuitive, but it's actually very musical. Let's say you want to adjust the release time on your filter so that once you've released the key, the filter kind of sweeps down and cuts all of the high frequencies away. Well, you're not going to hear that unless you have an equivalent change to your amplifier release in order to make that note sound longer. So connecting VDF and VDA together is a very common thing to do, and it's actually being done in the performance page. That's why you see those 2 values combined. Made lots of changes to this sound. I'm just going to reload my original combi back again so that I've got my bass sound to play with. Now jump over to the MIDI page. This is very straightforward. This is literally just controlling individual MIDI parameters for your single timbres. This is, for instance, where you can assign key splits, and in fact in the film score combi you can see that 2 of the sounds, tubular and piano 16, only actually operate on half the keyboard range. So if I play a high note, you're not hearing any tubular or piano there, and with the lower notes you do. Velocity zone is simply specifying what range over which it's going to respond to keystrokes on your keyboard, so you can make, for instance, the tubular only respond to very quiet notes, doing something like that. And then you can assign MIDI filters. I'm constantly pressing too deep into my keyboards and accidentally engaging Aftertouch. If that's something that's annoying you or going to interfere with your sound design, you can actually filter out Aftertouch from inside this page. DMP stands for damper, by the way. Then we have master detuning and transpose. Too simple, don't need to explain them. At this point, I'm going to introduce multis into the conversation because we've seen all of the primary functionality, and it should be pretty obvious to you at this point. A combi is all about producing a single homogeneous sound, and that's what I use. I'm using the M1 inside a recording environment here, inside a DAW. This is a single track generating a single sound. To be absolutely honest with you, I very often route everything to just outputs 1 and 2 and keep things very simple indeed. Multis stand at the other side of that complexity discussion. Now, rather than having a single sound, we're splitting the sound up into 8 individual units. So now there's no concept of loading a multi. That's not really something you do. When you head into the browser, you're taken to programs because you're going to put a single program into a single slot. So I've already preloaded piano and pipe organ. Let's put some drums on channel number 3. They're all completely independent sounds. Depending on what MIDI channel the M1 receives, it's going to output maybe one, maybe multiple of these sounds. So if I press a key now, we only hear the piano because my keyboard is currently outputting MIDI channel 1 messages. This distinction between combis and multis is really easy to miss and really easy to overstate as well. These are actually very simple differences between them. They have a dramatic effect on the usage of the tools, but actually really combis and multis are basically the same thing. They differ in 3 important respects. The first is the MIDI channel upon which they're communicating. So here we are in multi-mode, and look at the MIDI channel numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Each one of these sounds is corresponding on a dedicated different channel. So if I swap over MIDI channels 1 and 2, now my keyboard, which is outputting MIDI channel 1, outputs the organ sound. The second important difference is their outputs. By default, each one of the 8 timbres outputs to its own dedicated output channel. 1, 2, 3, 4. You see when I loaded this one up. Now it's very unfortunate that I accidentally, while I was talking, chose to load a drum kit into timbre number 3. Drum kits are one of the unusual exceptions in the M1 in that they output to 4, they're capable of outputting up to 4 separate channels. And you can see outputs A and B and C and D. And that was kind of a mistake. Let's kind of veer away from that for a moment. We've not actually discussed drum kits really, so I'm just going to load up a simple sound, and now you can see the story is much simpler. It's just outputting to 5 and 6. So that's the second difference. MIDI channel number 1, output channel number 2, and the third is how master effects are handled. In multi-world, every one of the 8 timbres is capable of an independent send and return into the master effects, and you can see how much of this sound do I want to send into the effects unit. Send 1 is primarily routed into effect number 1, and send 2 is primarily routed into effect number 2. Now you can see that there are some routing options. I'm not going to go through these today because they're relatively straightforward, but basically the difference between serial, whereas you can see send 1 is going to go through both effects 1 and 2 all of the time, and parallel, where you're splitting up the responsibility between these 2 different send channels. So there's a different means of interacting with the effects because you're fundamentally talking about 8 completely different sounds. This piano has nothing to do with the organ. In a DAW environment, such as I'm operating here, there are very few advantages to using a multi. In fact, the only one really is a very slightly reduced CPU burden because you're loading a single instance of the Korg. But if I was doing this job in the real world, I would have 3 tracks, one with the piano, one with the organ, and so on. It gives me far greater control to manipulate the majority of the preset of the values from inside Cubase, and I don't want the complexity of having to handle all of that inside the multi, particularly with my interaction between Cubase and the Korg being less than ideal. But that's really what it's all about. It's about having a genuinely multi-timbral instrument as opposed to combis where you're gathering everything together and squeezing it all into a single output. And I think that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you again. Thanks very much.